I've talked about this before, but one of my things is I feel like whenever you go too fantasy with Godzilla, that's where a lot of the issues come from. Whenever Godzilla films lay too much into the fantasy instead of the sci-fi, I feel like that's where a lot of the disconnect comes from, because Godzilla is a deeply sci-fi character. Godzilla is so deeply rooted in sci-fi. He has fantasy elements. And whenever they include so much fantasy that the sci-fi becomes the secondary part of the film, I feel like Godzilla films struggle. And if you look at the lower rated Godzilla films, most of them are the ones that lay too much into the fantasy elements. Sometimes you'll get an exception, like Godzilla vs. Ghidorah, which is a lower rated Godzilla film that leans more into the sci-fi aspects. But most of the time, the lower rated Godzilla films are the ones that lay into fantasy instead of sci-fi. It's because Godzilla is such a deeply rooted character in the atomic bomb, and because Godzilla is such a deeply rooted character in science fiction, that when you lay into the fantasy elements, it compromises what Godzilla stands for. And I think that is why, for me, Godzilla does not belong in the New Empire. Hey, it's D-Man from The Edit here. I could dedicate a whole video to this, and maybe at some point I will, because I think it's a really interesting topic, but there's other reasons why Godzilla doesn't work in the New Empire for me. It's simply not his story. For one, a lot of people complain about the way Godzilla was used in Godzilla vs. Kong and Godzilla Kong the New Empire, saying that it's his screen time is the issue. He's not on screen enough. He doesn't do enough. I don't think that's the issue. I think it's that Godzilla doesn't do enough meaningful things. For instance, Godzilla vs. Kong, a movie that people remember being a Kong movie. It's all about Kong. Godzilla's barely in it. Godzilla does not get enough to do. Godzilla has more screen time in that movie than he has in any MonsterVerse film so far. It's the way Godzilla's used, not how long he's used for. And with the New Empire, it's simply not Godzilla's story. It is a personal story, a personal journey about Kong finding a family, liberating his people, and taking on an opponent like himself. Kong's whole story in the MonsterVerse has been about finding family, finding creatures like himself, and he finally does, and one of them turns out to be a ruthless dictator. That's a super compelling conflict and a very interesting dynamic. And rather than playing thematically into it with Godzilla, having Kong find more of a found family with Zuko and Godzilla, rather than Scar King and the other apes. In fact, you could tie Mothra into that, you could also tie Gia and Monarch into that and make it a much more personal, compelling story for every single character. Instead, they added Shimo, a monster which only exists to give Godzilla justification to show up and do some punches at the end, as Kong can't take down Shimo without help. Kong and Godzilla teaming up, it means nothing thematically, it just simply happens because that's what they wanted to happen to sell tickets. It's why Godzilla feels like such wasted potential in the New Empire, as he doesn't actually exist for a story purpose. Yes, he exists because the story was written in a way that required him, but the story being told does not need Godzilla. Simply adding him isn't enough. It's kind of like how in Godzilla vs. Megalon, the film was written as a solo Jet Jaguar film, but Toho realized that wouldn't sell tickets, so they added Godzilla to the movie way late into production, and that's why Godzilla just kind of shows up to do nothing except punches and then leaves, and it's why the movie feels so shallow and hollow. It's a movie that completely falls apart as Godzilla's related, as he feels like an afterthought. I have the same critique of the New Empire, as it's actually a really wonderful Kong story that Godzilla just so happens to be in, even though Godzilla isn't adding anything to Kong's actual story. Godzilla's just there on his own side quest, and it's why he often feels like a distraction from the film rather than something that supports it. I think they needed to make the themes of the movie found family in order to get Godzilla to work, or something along those lines, but also the tone and the fantasy elements of Godzilla, as he's placed into a story and a world that I don't think he belongs in. I don't think Godzilla belongs in the fantasy world of Hollow Earth. I just don't think he does. Godzilla is a character that exists within the context of humanity. That's what makes him so interesting, and that's what makes him so compelling. That is what filmmakers since 1954 have understood, and when you take him out of that and place him in Hollow Earth to fight a big snow lizard, it loses the point. King Kong is a fantasy character. King Kong is a wonderful example of how to do fantasy monsters. King Kong can also make his way into science fiction just fine. Once you go too far with science fiction, you start to lose it. Once Kong King of the Apes gives Kong a jetpack, you lose it. Once Kong King of the Apes has Kong fighting robot T-Rexes, you lose it. Once Kong King of the Apes gives Kong a mechanized gauntlet, you lose it. Once Godzilla x Kong the New Empire gives Kong a beast glove, you lose it. It's a sci-fi tool that doesn't belong in the fantasy world. When you give Kong a godly axe, That is a fantasy weapon being given to a fantasy character. It's why all of us got used to it. It's why it's so cool. Same way, when Godzilla goes too far into fantasy, you lose it. When Kong goes too far into sci-fi, you lose it. Somehow, against all odds, they made King Kong fighting Mechagodzilla work. And I think it's because Godzilla was there to help ground those moments, but sometimes it goes a little too far. When Godzilla and Kong are doing the anti-gravity battle, I think that scene could have worked if it was executed better. And on the whole, I think that scene has a lot of wonderful moments. I actually love a lot of the ideas in that scene. I think that the scene didn't commit hard enough to its ideas. Godzilla has one cool moment where he's slapping around the apes. That's so fun. I love that. It's equal parts sci-fi and fantasy and funny and also awesome. Maybe it's just the way we get there with the pyramids hitting each other is what throws me off, where I'm like, it comes out of nowhere because it is a sci-fi concept. Maybe this is exactly what my issue with this is. Honestly, this is probably exactly why I don't like the collapsing gravity sequence. You have the two pyramids slap into each other that dismantles gravity in the area for a brief period of time, allowing Godzilla and Kong to do this epic fight. That is a sci-fi concept, the way they explain it. The way they explain they have to pour these liquids, get these pyramids to hit, the gravity goes boom. But it is a fantasy idea in the way it's executed. They don't develop the mechanism that makes that work. And with science fiction, we need to understand the mechanics of why things happen the way they do. And they do not explain it. They don't explain the way that the anti-gravity works. It just happens as a fantasy concept after being explained as a sci-fi concept. That's my big issue with it. And it especially pisses me off because the anti-gravity field in the center of Hollow Earth made sense to me in Godzilla vs. Kong. It is the center of the Earth. You'll hit a point in Hollow Earth where you get to the very center of Earth and gravity is being pulled in all the directions around you at the same time, and so therefore there would be no gravity there. You'd be floating around in it. Technically in real world, you'd get crushed because that'd be the most dense point of gravity in the entire planet, but it's a fantasy world. We've established a fantasy world and a sci-fi element of it, of this zone where gravity is being pulled outward instead of inward. And instead of having Godzilla and Kong fight in the anti-gravity zone, they do this weird thing with the pyramids hitting each other and turning gravity off. I don't get it. The problem is it wasn't set up well. The Hollow Earth was set up well in Godzilla vs. Kong. Godzilla x Kong didn't set hardly anything up properly. I think I agree. Maybe that's my big issue with the new Empire, is just that it is this tonal clash of constant sci-fi and fantasy that I think compromises both simultaneously. Kong Skull Island is such a fantasy film. It has a certain sci-fi sensibility in terms of the way the creatures move and behave and their biology and their physiology, but it is very much a fantasy film, which is why I think there's a certain amount of leeway when the monsters start fighting in the end, and it's very Evangelion and it's very anime inspired because it feels like, oh, you know, we're at this high concept fantasy. If they had introduced a robot glove to give to King Kong, it would have come out of nowhere and it would have compromised everything. It's why I always think that Mothra and King Kong is actually a more compelling duo than Godzilla and King Kong, because the two of them are both fantasy characters that I think you can go more into the fantasy realm with. Yeah, Goji thriller. That's what every live stream is. Every live stream is, we start out where I've got like something silly that I want to talk about, like how I absolutely nailed the design changes that Godzilla would undergo in Godzilla King of the Monsters, and then I perfectly predicted the new Empire, and then we wind up with me just ranting about like, we are so close. The MonsterVerse is so close to having its issues fixed, and that's what drives me crazy, is like, you let this bake for a little longer, so many of these issues go away. If you just commit a little harder to some of these ideas and to explaining why certain things happen, it goes away. Like the energy source in Godzilla vs. Kong. I thought it made sense. It made a certain sense to me. I did not understand why Kong would be drawn to the energy source and no other Titans would be, but Kong is drawn to the energy source in his temple. He harnesses it with the Godzilla axe. They sample it. They send the energy signal up to the people on the surface. They then synthesize it and use it to boost Mechagodzilla's power. It makes a certain sense to me to say that the rocks contain a certain type of energy that is very similar to Godzilla's energy, and that you needed to understand the frequency at which to program Mechagodzilla to get him to function right. That's what I thought was happening, but then the director during the commentary was like, I got no fucking clue how that works, it just does. I don't think you have to spend that much more time just coming up with a reason for why things happen. Like, I thought the energy source in GVK made sense. It made sense to me. It's an energy source that it like powers life in the Hollow Earth. It's like a certain type of radiation frequency that they analyze, and then they send it up to the surface world, and they're just replicating the signal. You know, they're replicating the frequency that Mechagodzilla needs to operate with. I thought was the idea. You know, like they had all the tools, they just needed to know exactly how to line them up. But I'm wrong! I was wrong! There is no reason. There is no reason. It just happens, it somehow just works. Because they don't know. Because they didn't think about it. It's like why I get so frustrated, because I'm like, we're so close to some solutions with so many of the issues I have. We're right there. I get so confused where I'm like, I don't understand. I really thought that one made sense. Godzilla 93, I'm glad you like the Beast Glove. I'm excited to get the toy. I'm excited to get the foam Beast Glove, and I'm excited to punch people with it. I'm gonna go punch my brother with that thing. I'm hoping for Rodan in the future too. I love Rodan. I love that it seems to make sense in the film, and then Wingard's just like, no, it didn't. I don't think that. Do you think Ghidorah was in Antarctica because he was trying to get to Hollow Earth? G-Man, I thought that was a wonderful theory that was raised after Godzilla King of the Monsters, that the reason Ghidorah was in Antarctica was because he was actually really freaking close to a Hollow Earth portal. I thought that made a lot of sense. Like, I thought that was a really interesting development, and that's not the type of thing they develop in the lore. Instead, they would rather create this like weird furry fan fiction where Godzilla's the alpha, and we take that term way too literally. And if he does an alpha roar at somebody and they don't listen to him, then he has full consent to kill them and he's in the right. I would have wished we would develop things like, why was Ghidorah in Antarctica so close to a Hollow Earth portal? Well, because he had already kind of taken over the surface world and he was probably heading to the Hollow Earth so he could do the same down there. Instead, we're told that Shimo froze Ghidorah somehow. How? I don't know. They don't either. Goji 93, sure you can have it both ways. The thing I'm saying is they are not committing to developing the things that seem obvious and in need of development. Instead, they are throwing random things at the wall. I honestly am not against fantasy Godzilla. I just think it needs to be its own universe and own continuity. No prerequisites. Sen, that's also a wonderful point. If you go full fantasy with Godzilla, but you do so in a way where it's like, we have no history associated with this franchise, I'm right there with you. The MonsterVerse started out as the real world with monsters and has become a fantasy cartoon. And that's where I think so many people like myself get hung up on it. But that's a good point. Yeah, I mean, if you have no history associated with it, I could see it working and being very interesting. But you gotta commit. If you're gonna go full fantasy, you gotta commit, man. You got to commit. I know Monarch is the last pillar of the sci-fi end of the MonsterVerse. It's quite interesting, and maybe it's why I love that show so much. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I want to give a huge thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. It's through the support of the patrons on Patreon that I can continue to make videos like this for you. If you want to support the Patreon, you can use the link in the description below. I also want to give a big thank you to my channel members. I really appreciate you guys as well. If you like this new format, this kind of Q&A format, especially from these live streams, taking clips from the live streams and expanding upon them, I would love to know down below, because I would love to keep doing this. I find these discussions to be really rewarding and engaging. So let me know what you think of them down below. Thank you guys all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you all next time for the next one. D-Man out.